I'm going to begin. Welcome everyone to a Botstiber Institute for Wildlife Fertility Control webinar. My name is Monique Principe and I am the Managing Director here. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And we are delighted to have Paul Cryer with us to present. His presentation is called Providing Ecological and Social Context for Elephant Immunocontraception, a case study in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. Also joining us on screen today is Stephanie Boyles-Griffin. And Stephanie, if you want to introduce yourself and then tell us a little bit about Paul.
My pleasure. So depending on where you're joining us around the world, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone. I'm Stephanie Boyles-Griffin, and I'm the Science and Policy Director for the Botstiber Institute for Wildlife Fertility Control. And it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, Paul Cryer. Paul is the coordinator of the African Conservation Trust's Applied Ecology Unit, where he focuses on the expansion of conservation areas for priority species, especially elephant and rhino, by working with local communities to co-create innovative solutions to the socio-economic and environmental issues facing people and the environment. To mitigate human-elephant conflict, he has developed and led training in elephant behavior, specifically for conservation staff and community members encountering elephant on foot. Paul holds a Bachelor of Science in Zoology and a Master of Science in Environmental Management. Working as a wilderness guide in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, he set up and managed environmental education projects for disadvantaged youth and participants from other countries in national parks and provincial nature preserves. On behalf of the Provincial Conservation Authority, Paul chairs the Mfolozi Wilderness Area Steering Committee. He is a board member of the Wilderness Leadership School and an advisory board member of the peer-reviewed journal Ecological Citizen. Paul also serves as a director of the Rex the Rhino Conservation Trust, a body that accesses and allocates resources for South African rhino conservation and security. And in addition to all of that, he also has direct involvement with rhino security training and surveillance. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Paul.
Thanks, Stephanie. Hello, everybody. I want to start by saying some thanks, put my thank you slide at the beginning, primarily because this case study I'm about to go through today has really been a team effort. And there are some particular people that I would want to mention. So beyond saying thank you to HSUS and Botstiber, the Humane Society, and particularly Teresa Telecki, Audrey Delsink, and Adam Payman. The whole of Esimvelo has been, Esimvelo KZN Wildlife is the management agency in KwaZulu-Natal, and they've been very supportive. But in particular, I want to mention Pete Runard, who's the conservation manager of Ithala Game Reserve. In my own organization, I want to thank the executive who've been very, very supportive, particularly Carl Grossman and Francois de Toy. And perhaps most especially would be my colleagues, Stephen Matema and Sihle Mtetwa, who have done the bulk of the stakeholder engagement with this particular case study. So we're going to be looking at Ithala Game Reserve and the surrounds of Ithala Game Reserve. And this is a reserve in the eastern province of South Africa, KwaZulu-Natal, and in the northern part of it. It's a 30,000 hectare reserve. It's got just over 200 elephants in it, which is a density a little bit too high. So the elephant strategy works on kind of three principles. The one would be opportunistically removing live removals and translocations of groups of elephants to other areas when we can. But the ongoing strategy is going to be based on reducing the growth rate with immunocontraception, which started in 2014, and then looking at habitat expansion for elephants. I think that, you know, from the outset, when I first came to understand contraception and immunocontraception in particular, I was immediately taken with it. But that's not automatically the case. I find out that there's a resistance from a number of quarters, different quarters. You know, from on the one hand, not wanting to disturb animals at all, and then on the other side, the process interfering with meat production, and somewhere in between, the idea that there is an obligation with limited funds of sorting out too many elephants with lethal control. And while that when you're dealing with multiple stakeholders, one cannot ignore those different viewpoints because they're going to surface periodically in different settings. So in today's presentation, I'm going to be moving between local issues that pertain particularly to Ithala Game Reserve and contrasting them with global perspectives. I'm going to be starting with the global perspective and then moving down towards Ithala. I suppose with a kind of spoiler alert, there's going to be a long introduction before we get back to Ithala Game Reserve. And you'll see why. Throughout today, I'm going to be using the words complicated and complex, and I would just like to explain what I mean by those terms. This is a description. It's a route to get to a good dog walking place from my home. It's a complicated description, but it's accurate. If you follow it, you'll get to exactly the same destination every time. You could use parts of it. You could even use it in reverse and get to my house. So although it's complicated, there is a really predicted outcome. And perhaps even more importantly, if you simplify it, you get a good result. So simplification of a complicated situation is valid. But that's not always the case. Simplification doesn't always work. This is a photograph taken inside a thorn tree. Although it looks fairly chaotic, there's actually a degree of order in there. Although the order that is there is invisible when you're looking at it at the scale. It's likely that the order will manifest at a larger order of magnitude or a larger temporal scale because it involves multiple systems interacting at the same time. And very often at the scale at which you're working, you can't see the order that is going to be manifest. One has to kind of step back to that in order to see the structure that evolves, and also recognize that order may replicate itself in multiple different orders of magnitude. There are some recognitions that I would like to make from the outset, and the first one of those is that with regards to the relationship between the developed and developing world, there is a need for economic reform. It's time. I mean, we need to shift from a mechanistic view of the world into something that is more understanding of complexity, and economics is probably one of the leading areas where that applies. That quote comes from Otto Scharmer, who's done a fair amount of work looking at how economic systems have responded to crisis. Just going to move my little screen around. Here we go. There we go. Yeah, and certainly the COVID-19 situation has been an example where the vulnerabilities of current economic systems have surfaced. If we look at that, this is a cartoon by Graham McKay, and I hope you won't mind if I make some changes to it, but I think a lot of people have. Looking at the situation locally, at any situation locally, we tend to focus on local issues that are important to us. But along came COVID-19, and suddenly we found it acceptable for governments or institutions to spend large amounts of money on preventing or averting a crisis. McKay's cartoon indicates that, well, there are waves behind the waves, and there are three principles here which I want to highlight. The one would be elephants, rhinos, redwoods are the ambassadors of biodiversity in some respect, but the bulk of biodiversity is made up with small things. Mosses, ferns, trees. And to what extent the large biodiversity scale is going to be protected by protecting the ambassadors is a debate, but it's one worth having. The question that emerges with the situation is, how can we justify spending money on immunocontraception for elephants or rhino security when there are people who don't have their basic needs covered? And I think what the last period has shown us is that if we have these crises heading towards us, spending money on them is looking after people. And it's in the highlight, the idea of spending money on vaccines and spending money on other economic issues and climate change and the biodiversity issues does matter, and addressing those issues in a holistic way and acknowledging the complexity of those interactions is moving away from the mechanistic reductionist linear processes with which we made decisions previously, which may have created short-term wealth, but they were also probably causal in many of the large disasters that are heading towards us. And I'll come back to that concept a bit later. Yeah, that slide, it just indicates the World Economic Forum ranks the risks, and I think 6 of the top 10 risks are now environmental. The third recognition I want to make pertains to other areas of science and research with regards to elephants, and much has been done on how elephants perceive, and then how the brains process what those senses pick up, and then how they manifest in behaviors. And apart from the fact that many of those aspects of behavior were things that we used to separate humanity from other animals in terms of value, but beyond that, I think the point is that we can't deny this anymore. The idea of using elephants as a kind of mechanistic tool and deciding what they are and treating them like inanimate objects, if we do that, well, we're really ignoring the science, and that makes the practice bad science. So it means that interaction with how we deal with elephants, it adds another layer of complexity, the nature of their being. Okay, so with that background, let's start. Historically, elephants have basically inhabited anywhere they could get a good drink, and with a wide variety of diet involved in that. By 1960, we had realized that the habitat had become drastically reduced and fragmented, and in the current day, it's reduced to areas which are either very, very remote and uninhabited or connected with some form of protected area. The numbers associated with that show that in the last 100 years, we've dropped from about a rough estimate of 10 million down to less than 500,000. That we call that kind of decimation human-elephant conflict. There's probably a better name for it. If we look at population density, we see that Africa is increasing in density more than other parts of the world, in fact. And if we look at the prognosis for the future, it doesn't look particularly good. And the conventional wisdom is that the land change associated with humanity is one of the causal effects of biodiversity loss. I think we have to recognize, though, that many of the drivers which is causing that land change actually emanates from outside of Africa, which means that the manner in which we address those issues has to be global. And of course, there is some serious complexity. I also want to just make the acknowledgement that looking at elephant populations in different parts of Africa are going to demand very different strategies. The circumstances are very different in different areas, and particularly in South Africa, outside of Kruger National Park, we're looking at usually small protected areas with that are fenced. So those populations are isolated, largely speaking, not always, but largely. So this raises the question, well, if we've got so few elephants and it's such a fragmented area, that surely our strategy should be to increase those protected areas and to increase the number of elephants. What possible role can contraception have? Well, I mean, it would be a real mistake to say that the purpose of contraception is to ultimately limit the number of elephants. I think it's part of a larger strategy. Even if we take the continental strategy that we do want to expand those conservation areas, and certainly that's part of the intention of the CBD, to expand conservation and create those corridors, and elephant conservation and elephant behavior is something that we can use one of the tools that we could use to recognize those corridors. But within that strategy, there's going to be times when we do need to limit the number of elephants in one particular area or limit movement in another. So really, immunocontraception in this regard is not about merely limiting the number of elephants. It's about altering a very old trend of antagonism between humanity and mega herbivores. And it's about reframing that. And it has a strategic use within that system. Staying with the CBD for a moment, I want to look at these other two components. The top one was conservation of biodiversity. The next one is the sustainable use of its components and the fair and equitable sharing of its benefits. I think that before the ink was dry when that was written, I think there were people looking to exploit those for personal gain or collective gain. And how is that done? Well, generally speaking, it's done through the identification and the exploitation of externalities. And who's externalized? Who or what is externalized in this? Well, certainly it would be human community members that have been denied their voice. And it would also be non-human community members who've never had a voice. Now, Africa has had a very long history of people who are looking to exploit the people and the environment in Africa. But no sooner had colonialism, the colonial era, come to an end, when there were new players that were quite prepared to take up the same kind of modus operandi. So while the players have changed, the game remains the same. And if we go back to the idea that we need to justify why we're going to be spending money on biodiversity, and that it's good for the whole, we have to caution ourselves that we don't end up with that mindset where we have people using the principle for personal gain. And make no mistake, I think in Africa there is enormous distrust of change and of outsiders. And when programs come in saying we're looking to improve, I think communities have grown to be rightfully suspicious. So I want to park all of those principles, and we're going to pull them in at various times, and you'll see them emerge as we go through, get back to Ithala Game Reserve. So it's a mountainous reserve. There's 1,000-meter elevation difference inside the reserve, and there's some open grasslands, but there's a lot of woodland. And as you head down towards the river, there's some very, very thick woodland, incredibly thick vegetation. So unlike the slide advertising this webinar with elephants in the open, this is mostly how we encounter elephants in Ithala. The community, the reserve is community owned by 2 communities. And so the reserve is co-managed between the land owning communities and the appointed land management agency, Ezemvelo KZN Wildlife, or Ezemvelo for short. And that's the de jure situation with regards to management. How the de facto situation would reflect the de jure situation would probably vary depending on who you spoke to. And that's certainly a challenge, an ongoing challenge and an ongoing area of work. Three sides of the reserve are fenced, but the northern side at the Pongola River is unfenced. And that makes this case study useful not only to South African reserves, but in similar situations of unfenced areas in countries to the north of us. There are about 5,000 homesteads, about 26,000 people around the park. Many of them are sufficiently far away and buffered by those communities closer to the park that we estimate about 10,000 people are directly affected by the proximity of the park. The elephants will go anywhere where there's basically not a cliff. And with an unfenced northern boundary, they're embarking on excursions outside the park as well. So remembering that within our strategy for elephant management, that habitat expansion was part of it, and in the middle and late 90s and in the early 2000s, there were two attempts to engage in habitat expansion. They hit deadlock. By 2014, when we started immunocontraception, there was absolute deadlock. In some instances, there was just poor communication and failure. In other instances, certain communities would not engage with KZN wildlife at all. And that's the situation that we started with when we started engaging with these communities. And I would say that it wasn't a process which has a start and an end and a kind of tick box process to say, yep, we've done it. It started 5 years ago, and it carries on and it repeats and goes around. Some of those interactions are very informal, standing around having a cool drink at a shop. Some of them are meeting under a tree like this, and some of them are formal meetings inside traditional courts. There's many ways of dividing up how you look at communities and how they interact with agricultural needs, the social structures that make them up, and the relationship with land use. But it's important to recognize that those divisions are synthetic, and in fact, they're really interlinked. I want to speak for one moment. I mentioned my colleagues earlier on, just the importance of that work which I don't do, by the way, just the importance of it and how hard it is. It involves intensive listening over a long period of time and acknowledging the histories of that area and damage that's been done. It involves taking steps that all aspects of society are included and engaging in the process. And it's also pointing out, communities will sometimes pick up a particular strategy that is linear within a complex circumstance, and that needs to be unpacked in a way that is unconfrontational. So it's very special work, and I wanted to pay tribute to that. Within that, I want to focus on one particular aspect, and it's looking at the socio-economic component, where we take a hypothetical society with a number of economic entities, and those economic entities could be a small business, it could be families, it could be individuals. But within these communities, it's certainly true in our circumstances, there are gatekeepers. And those gatekeepers are instrumental in controlling decision-making, power, money, energy in various forms, such that the society takes on a very pyramidic structure. And we got to thinking, well, that it's very hard to work. It's very hard to be innovative under that system. So we got to thinking about how external institutions, especially those that were keen on the ideology that we were putting forward, could interact in a slightly different way, recognizing that many institutions are going to have different perspectives in terms of global issues, local issues. So we got to thinking that whilst those institutions would always have to go through the gatekeepers initially, to not do that would be disrespectful and even dangerous. But to use that process as an opportunity to create direct links with various entities in the community. And in so doing, you would be diminishing the effect of those gatekeepers ultimately, with the result that in creating many entrances for impact, the pyramidal structure would be replaced by this very complex network that would interact in various ways. And that we came up, well, we didn't come up, but we started using the term the polycentric hyperlocal economy. Now, the ACT staff had to then go into the communities and say, well, how will this fly? Will this have any relevance? Will it? And it did. It had huge relevance. Various individuals and groups would figure out where they could fit in, what they could do. And by clumping those into groups, we created this kind of diagram where the interests of that community were all, multiple communities in fact, were reflected in this particular way. And you could track that certain of those activities would bring money, goods and services from the outside into that community. Those are the green ones, and the blue ones would assist in circulating that energy, money, goods and services within that community. So one can pick up any one of those and say, right, if we track where the goods and services, money, energy goes in a primary, secondary, and tertiary manner, you can see how that creates that web really functions. And if you apply that to each of those activities which bring in energy, money, goods, and services, you're creating something which has very high resilience. But perhaps even more importantly, it created huge interest. There was a real fascination with this and how it would actually work, what would constitute it. That very, very small businesses and some larger ones would all have a say in this. And it was a real fascination with those communities. We had our first crack at hyperlocal economics when the COVID-19 lockdown started relaxing and we could hold meetings again, and we needed to ensure that the people who were at those meetings would have masks. So, assisted by HSI, we created little local businesses that would make these masks. It basically resulted in instead of that money going into some manufacturing plant in the city, that all of that money was entered into the community. Someone had shown me this photograph two years ago. I would have been really perplexed. But that was a meeting where there were 52 people, and only 4 arrived with masks. And in fact, all of the masks you see there were made by that community. So, but one of the principles that emerged here was there was an awareness in looking at this this kind of web. There was an awareness that it was linked to a global perspective, that at a larger scale, biodiversity was valued, and elephants in particular were valued. So when you started to look at which of those enterprises that the community came up with would be benefited by the proximity of elephants, it was quite a few. And that raises the question in terms, a number of questions, in fact. How do we institute something that is going to reduce human-elephant conflict by those elephants getting out and actually getting to where people live? And at the same time, how do we strengthen that elephant input into the communal economy, into the community's system, by increasing elephant habitat? Well, in a nutshell, we came up with this idea of sticking up a two-strand fence that would hopefully contain elephants, but not change other land use. So in other words, we know the elephants are getting out of Ithala Game Reserve, north of the Pongola River. The communities may be happy for part of their area to contain those elephants, but they don't want them moving beyond it. And at the same time, they want their current land uses inside the area of elephant habitat to continue. Now, anyone who's fenced elephants before will be saying, will be sending me pictures of elephants climbing under fences. And so, yes, we're aware that that in certain areas, when we're putting this up along cliff edges, the two-strand fence is not going to be necessary. And in other areas that are likely to be challenged, we have to come up with something a little bit more robust. But the concept that has been put out there is around the two-strand electric fence. And the principle of it is that if the elephants get too near, they get zapped and turn around, but that cattle can move underneath without any risk. And At the same time, it's not going to endanger human beings unless they're 2 meters tall. And even then, it won't be a great risk. The part that's most interesting to me is that we're now getting conversations around elephant habitat expansion linked to a modified socio-economic system. And the questions are being raised: to what extent these are linked, to what extent, what are the risks associated with that? And these conversations are taking place right now, as it turns out. And the outcome of this is that communities are looking at, this is a part of on the northwestern part of Ithala Game Reserve. The communities in that area are looking at possible positions for the fence that would increase elephant habitat, that will assist in those communities establishing a more dynamic economy, and at the same time reducing human-elephant conflict. I really want to stress at this point the difference of where we were in 2014, where there was just an absolute lack of communication, and now 7 years later we're involved in very inclusive strategizing about our way forward around not only the sustainability of the communities outside and what that would do to creating a good relationship between parks and communities that hasn't existed for a very long time, certainly not in this area, and also looking at expanding elephant habitat in a novel way. So to summarize this in a sentence, we're really looking at the methodology is about validating people who were previously excluded or marginalized, not included in the system, and getting them to actively participate in issues, including elephant management. And to do that by acknowledging that complexity, acknowledging the radical interconnectedness of all things, including the well-being of people and the well-being of the environment, and using that to co-create in a very interactive way to find novel solutions that have a validity in terms of economics, in terms of environmental sustainability, and in terms of the structures that exist in those communities. What this means from an immunocontraception perspective is that this doesn't mean that immunocontraception is embedded in this project to reduce, to limit elephant numbers. It's about shifting consciousness. It's about being part of a bigger picture that is around shifting consciousness and creating a tolerance towards elephants in a collaborative and integrated way. Now, the downside is this process is time consuming and it's expensive. So if you're expecting to be able to knock this off in 6 months with the assistance of some very enthusiastic graduates, you'd be very disappointed, and so the communities and probably so the graduates. So that's not really an option. It's gonna need integrated teams and experienced staff doing that work. Looking at the upside, I'm not really sure that is an upside or really just a clumsily inverted downside, but I suppose the upside is it's acknowledging that what the risk is, and the risk would be basically doing anything short of this level of interaction, of this level of inclusion within that system. That the idea of cutting corners, of limiting this kind of interaction, in the end, I believe does create greater risk, and I think probably the demise of many projects. The thing that I want to point out finally is that when we talk about this level of complexity, we're saying that the well-being of humanity and the well-being of the greater Earth community, the greater non-human community, are inextricably linked. Historically, treating the non-human community, the environment, with empathy was a moral luxury afforded to those who had a full stomach. But now it's pointing to an ecological necessity, and one that steers us away from environmental catastrophe. Yeah, and I think I'll end it there.